Chapter 8. Naruto and Fu stared at the silver-haired man, who stood in the center of the seal he engraved in the ground in blood, his skin black with white, skeletal patterns. "What's he talking about?" Fu asked, her eyes narrowed and her body tense in concern over their immortal adversary's transformation. While Naruto felt the same trepidation she did, he made a cross-shaped hand seal, summoning 5 more shadow clones. "What's it matter? The guy's off his rocker. Now let's take him down." With that, the clones ran forward, ready to engage the man and see what the purpose behind his transformation was. Hidan just grinned as he raised the pike and stabbed himself in the leg. Suddenly, Naruto's eyes widened as pain shot through his system and his clones burst. He grit his teeth and gripped his leg and fell on one knee as blood suddenly seeped into his pants. In the exact same place where Hidan had just stabbed himself. Fu ran to the blonde's side, panic clear on her face. "Naruto." She stared at his wound, her gaze returning to the Akatsuki as she understood what was happening. Both Jinchuriki had realized that Hidan had somehow just linked their bodies together. It became chillingly clear to both now just why he was an S-rank threat. He was unkillable by being able to shrug off any injury, and by taking in the blood of his opponent, he could curse them and link their bodies together, and with his immortality, he could run himself through his heart and act like it was nothing. His opponent, however, wouldn't be so lucky. Hidan cackled as he took in Fu's panicked expression and Naruto's pain-filled, furious one. "The pain as my enemy passes from this world radiates through my body and transcends agony into ecstasy. What's wrong with this guy?" Fu wondered in the back of her mind in disgust over his sadomasochistic tendencies, but that thought was far from the surface of her thoughts. She had to stop Hidan from hurting Naruto through their link. Seeing no way to get out of the situation, having no technique that wouldn't injure Hidan and himself, Naruto turned his ocean orb towards his fellow Jinchuriki. "Fu," he said, getting her attention. "Run, get out of here." He didn't like his chances. Oh, he wasn't giving up, but he couldn't think of a way to attack and incapacitate Hidan without injuring him, knowing that the man could easily run him through should he try. Not an easy task, especially with the hole in his leg. "What?" Fu questioned in shock before her expression switched to a deadpan look and giving a slight scoff. "Yeah, because leaving you here with an apparent immortal is a brilliant decision. And it's not like he'll catch up to me after he goes through you or anything." Then her face twisted in anger. "Do you really think I'll just leave you like this?" She stood up, facing the missing nin. "I'll find a way to get you out of this. Just you wait." She had to save him. He was the first person who'd managed to worm his way into her heart in so many years. The first real friend she'd had, the only person who could relate to her, and he was in this mess because of her. She felt like, if she failed, she might as well give herself up because she'd never be able to live with herself afterwards. "Heh. What do you plan to do?" "Now that he's under my curse, all I have to do," Hidan said, pointing his blade to his stomach, "is stab myself to injure the brat. You two are fucked." Her face a mask of determination, Fu formed a hand sign and created 3 water clones out of the nearby puddles. "Don't riot," Hidan threatened. Fu and her duplicates charged forward. Hidan drew his hand back to stab himself when Fu and 2 clones stopped, each making a single hand sign before throwing out their hands as new weapons formed. "Water style, water whip." The 3 quickly formed and threw out whips of water, wrapping around his arms and ensnaring both his wrists. Hidan grit his teeth as the final clone charged towards him, intent on finding some way to break Hidan's curse as a swarm of insects flew forth to drain him of his strength. Hidan dropped his scythe, holding onto its cord as he kicked it in the clone's direction, destroying it before grinning and pulling it back. Fu's eyes widened as she saw what he was going to do. No. All 3 of the scythe's blades stabbed Hidan diagonally through the stomach, though the man didn't seem to react beyond being pushed back by the impact. Fu's horrified gaze turned back to Naruto as he coughed up blood, holding his stomach as blood seeped into his clothing as Hidan began chuckle, his cackles slowly building until insane laughter echoed through the clearing. The blonde's eyes widened as pain lanced through his system as he struggled to breath. It hurt as much as when Sasuke stabbed him in the lung with his Chidori. His vision was quickly growing cloudy, his consciousness fading away in the wake of the pain. He felt his strength ebbing away and fell forward as the pain and blood loss overwhelmed him. "Naruto." She caught him just before he could hit the ground, flipping him over so he was facing her. He was breathing shallowly, his eyes dull as his grip on the waking world continued to slacken. Naruto struggled to speak as his normally vibrant ocean blue orbs turned to her, trying to tell her to run while she still could, but all that came out were a few wet hacks as more blood spilled out of his lips. He moved his lips once more, but all that came out was a sick, gurgling sound as the crimson liquid found its way into his lungs. Fu could only stare at him as she held him close, her face a mask of pain, anguish, and fear. Not for herself, but for him. Blood flowed out of the blonde's wounds, dyeing her pure white clothing crimson, but she hardly felt the warm, wet liquid. Her entire body was numb as emotion overwhelmed her. All she could feel was the limp body in her arms. All she could see were his dulling eyes. Fu's memories. Fu had just shared another tale of her past with the blonde, a mission that involved guarding the daimyo of their country. She'd been forced to use the Nanabi's power to save herself and protect him. She remembered it fondly because while her teammates had scorned her for using her Biju's power, the daimyo had thanked her for her efforts. It was one of the few times in her life anyone had truly thanked her. "I noticed that you try to avoid talking about your teammates," Naruto pointed out, tilting his head to the side. Fu scowled, turning away from him. "I don't want to talk about those jerks." "Why not?" Fu shook her head. "You wouldn't understand. Trust me, I know a thing or two about messed up teams." Naruto then told her about how he, Sakura and Sasuke got along. Or more precisely, didn't at first. Sasuke sounded like an arrogant jerk, and Naruto couldn't stand that he was more skilled than he was, and Naruto let Sakura get away with beating him up for the smallest of reasons because he was apparently in love with her from the way he talked about her. After hearing that, Fu shared a bit about her own team. Her teammates basically hated her, constantly belittling her, mocking her if she failed and disparaging her when she succeeded, while her sensei ignored her most of the time. "You shouldn't care what they think," Naruto stated. "If they can't see you for who you are, then just forget about them and find someone who can." Fu just scoffed. Easier said than done, just about everyone in Taki felt that way. Though then, her lips spread out into a small smile. There had been two people besides Shibuki and his father who had treated her like a human, and now, Naruto too. Present. How could this have happened? Her friend, the only friend she had ever had, the only person she'd ever met who could truly understand her, was dying right before her eyes, and she could do nothing to stop it. He was here because of her. He'd come after her when she tried to throw her life away, protected her from the Akatsuki and saved her from them and from the crushing despair that had enveloped her, and yet, she was powerless to save him. Since the moment they'd met, he'd tried to be there for her, and what had she done when he needed her? She'd failed, and now all she could do was watch as his life drained from his eyes, his breathing becoming more and more shallow as the seconds ticked by. Fu's memories. The two Jinchuriki laughed together as Naruto told her about his friends. Specifically, some of the things he used to get up to with Shikamaru, Kiba, and Choji back when they were kids. How they used to skip class and pull all kinds of pranks on the village. Well, except Shikamaru, who felt it too troublesome. Fu faced him with an amused grin. "Wow, you guys really know how to have fun. Nothing like that ever happens around here. Too bad. Taki's a nice place, but it sounds kind of boring." Naruto replied, leaning back and resting his head on his hands. Fu looked out onto the water's surface as she thought how nice it must be to have people around you. "I wish I had friends like that," she said quietly, but the blonde heard her. "What are you talking about?" Naruto asked, drawing her attention as he sat up. He pointed his thumb at his chest and gave her his fox-like smile. "You have me, don't you?" Fu was surprised by his declaration and then gave a thankful smile, her heart warming as she realized that for the first time in so long there was someone close to her. Present. She felt like someone had ripped open her chest and tore out her heart. Pain unlike anything she'd ever imagined ate away at her chest and hitched in her throat. She couldn't move, she couldn't think. All she could do was hold him desperately as the pain grew by the second, and her eyes began to burn as tears welled up in her orange pools. Fu's memories. Naruto? He turned to look at the girl, who was giving him a smile. A warm, truly thankful smile. "Thank you for being here." The blonde Jinchuriki had a similar expression as he replied. "I'm your friend, Fu. If you need me, just ask. I'll come running." Present. Finally, the blonde mercifully lost consciousness, his head falling limply to the side as his eyes closed. Fu took in a sharp breath and froze, ceasing to even breathe as she stared at the lifeless boy. Hidan chuckled. Well, that's one of you out of the way. He stated as his skin returned to normal, remembering he needed to take him alive and unable to risk causing him any more damage. I should probably take care of you quickly before he bleeds out. So, any chance of you coming quietly now? His smirk fell when the girl didn't respond, her head falling forward, covering her eyes in shadow as she continued to stare at the blonde in her arms. Her entire body felt numb as she trembled, the only thing she felt was pain, her breath caught as a hard lump formed in her throat. She felt warm liquid flow down her cheeks. She couldn't even think clearly enough to realize she was crying for the first time in 5 years. He wasn't moving. She could barely even tell if he was breathing or not. He looked like he was already dead. The very thought was enough to cause her to choke as the pain intensified. And this insane, religious nut job had enjoyed every moment of this. His laughter at Naruto's suffering rung through her ears. He'd savored Naruto's pain. Fu hated a lot of people, but at this moment, Haiden rose to the very top of that list as an anger unlike anything she'd ever felt before, even on the worst days back in Taki, welled up inside her, washing away all other emotion. The world around her was shifting, a blood-red haze falling over it as her mind was overcome with anger and hatred. All directed towards the silver-haired man standing just a few yards away from her. As all thoughts left her in the wake of unfathomable rage, she gently laid Naruto down with her shaky arms. As the hatred grew by the moment, she could feel a familiar, malevolent chakra begin to mix with and overwhelm her own. With a low growl, she suddenly vanished. Haiden's eyes widened before he sensed a dark presence above him. Looking up, he saw Fu falling towards him, pulling her fist back as an aura of red chakra surrounded her body. Fu's biju took the form of a rhinoceros beetle. Proportionate to its size, rhinoceros beetles are the single strongest creatures in the world, capable of lifting 100 times its own body weight, the most powerful species of which being capable of lifting a whopping 850 times their weight. This was a trait that the Nanabi shared to a degree, being the most physically powerful of all the biju, and as such its chakra carried a disproportionately large enhancement to its bearer's physical strength. Hidan leapt back as Fu crashed down, her fist colliding with the ground and creating a crater half the size of her body, kicking up a massive cloud and sending small cracks throughout the immediate area of the impact. Hidan's eyes widened in shock as he raised his arm to shield his face from the dust and debris Fu's attack caused. As he landed, dragging his feet for a few moments, the cloud spiraled as a red glow grew out from the center, whips of red chakra lashing out and carving gashes into the ground. What the hell? Before he could react, a claw made out of red chakra burst from the twisting cloud and sped towards him. Due to the closeness of the attack, all he could do was raise his arms to defend as it slammed into him and drove him backwards through 2 trees before slamming him into the ground hard enough to carve a crevice into it, his pike falling to the ground. As Hidan quickly picked himself up, chunks of wood and pebbles littering his back from the impacts, he saw what had happened to his target within the cloud. Fu raised herself out of the crater, standing on all fours, placing a single hand outside of its boundary. Her body was encased in a cloak of bubbling red chakra. A horn extended from the head of the cloak, matching the Nanabi's own, and 3 tails of chakra grew out from around her tailbone, the middle tail long and thin, and the other 2 shaped like the wings of an insect. Her hands had become sharp claws, her canines elongated into fangs, and her eyes had changed to reflect the demon whose power coursed through her. Unlike Naruto, whose eyes would become red and resemble a fox's when in his Jinchuriki forms, or Gaara's whose sclera would turn black as he gained the amber eyes and shuriken-shaped pupils of Shukaku, Fu's iris seemed to have extended to cover the entire orb, and since her pupils weren't visible, that left her entire eye pure orange, gleaming dangerously in the moonlight. Geez, what a mess. Now I'm going to have to deal with this oversized bug. Hidan commented before raising his scythe. Show me what you've got, Nanabi. With a snarl which built into a roar, Fu shot towards him. Hidan leapt to the side and dodged the blow, but rather than land, the green-haired Jinchuriki's wing-like chakra tails began to beat rapidly, allowing her to fly and propelling her through the air. She twisted around a tree and sped to her adversary, her arm pulled back as she prepared to launch another attack. Naruto's mindscape. Naruto wondered if he had died. One moment, he had been in agony, rapidly losing consciousness as his blood slipped out onto the ground, and the next he was suddenly strangely comfortable. There was no pain or danger he could sense, just the sensation of floating in a cool liquid. Cracking open his ocean blue orb, He found himself not in the boundaries of the pure world, but in the familiar, sower-like domain of his mindscape. He shot up, causing the water to splash around him. This was no time to kick back and relax. He was in danger. Fu was in danger. He needed to wake up and get back to the fight. But the reason he was here was because his body was a wreck. Even if he could force himself back to the waking world, he wouldn't be able to lift a finger to help his fellow Jinchuriki. What was he going to do? Suddenly, a deep, sinister chuckle echoed out from behind him. Naruto twisted around to find himself before the cage of the Kyuubi, its mouth etched in a wicked grin. What a surprise. It seems like you've gotten yourself in over your head again. Naruto raised himself to his feet and turned to the massive Biju, his brow furrowed. Why am I here? What? Not even a hello after all this time? The fox questioned, amusement clear in its massive, crimson orbs. Naruto swept out his arm angrily and took a step towards the cage containing the massive beast. This was no time to joke around. Cut the crap. Why'd you bring me here? I had nothing to do with it. This is your mind, remember? The fox replied, sighing. And I had hoped that you'd grown a brain in that empty skull. Then again, I should have known better since you've dragged us into yet another mess. Now Naruto snarled. I was trying to protect a friend. And what about you? Aren't you Biju the same kind? Don't you give a damn that the Nanabi would have been captured by these psychos along with Fu? The fox scoffed, turning its head away and closing its eyes. I could care less what happens to the others. Besides, that insect is the third strongest among us. If he can't take care of himself, then why should I bother? Naruto frown deepened before his mouth twisted into a grin. I think you care about what's happened more than you let on. The fox opened a single eye and glared down at him. What was that? Naruto tilted his head forward, closing his eyes and raising his hand in an explanatory gesture. I've been knocked out a bunch of times, but this is the first time I've ever been pulled to my cage. He opened his eyes, his ocean blue eyes staring into the fox's crimson orb. The last time this happened, you wanted to give me your power to save your own skin. Want to know what I think? I think I only get pulled here when one of us wants me to be here. And I know it wasn't me, so who does that leave? The fox growled dangerously. Whether or not it was to help yourself or the Nanabi, you don't want me to just lay there waiting to bleed out or for them to drag me who knows where so they can do kami knows what with you. Give me some chakra so I can get us out of this mess. The fox was silent for a moment before he began chuckling, the rumble of the sound echoing throughout the sower-like mindscape. Well, I suppose you have matured a bit under the wing of that pathetic excuse for a sage. You're correct, I don't wish to fall into their hands, so I suppose I have little choice. Tendrils of red chakra flowed out from between the bars of the cage, wrapping around the blonde. It wasn't like the first time this had happened, back when he was falling to an apparent death. It was so much more. It was even more than when he'd fought Sasuke. You should be grateful to me, time and time again. I've had to bail you out. Naruto would have retorted, but he found himself flung out of the mental world. Reality. Back in the real world, Naruto's blue orbs opened as a burning power began to course through his system. He was alone in the clearing, Fu and Hidan's battle having steadily moved away in the past few moments. Red chakra bubbled up around his body as the amazing regenerative powers of the Kyuubi caused his wounds to heal, closing in mere seconds as his blood rapidly multiplied, replacing what had spilled out into his cloths and onto the ground. As the chakra continued to flow, it began to take form as his body changed under its influence once again as he rose up before falling forward, standing on all fours, screwing his eyes shut as he growled, his voice growing more guttural. Like Fu, his hands became claws as his canines extended, becoming fangs. His eyes shot open, revealing crimson orbs with silted pupils as the chakra exploded around him, whipping around and damaging the surrounding earth and the tree behind him. Finally, it wrapped around his body, coalescing into the shape of a fox with two tails. All his senses enhanced by the vile chakra of the Biju, he could hear the battle raging nearby and bolted towards it. Meanwhile, Hidan leapt down on the currently grounded Fu, pulling the cord of his scythe, making it come at her from the sight as he prepared to run her through with a pike or throw it should she dodge. These efforts were fruitless, however, when Fu inhaled and then let out a roar, sending out a shockwave that blew Hidan and his weapon away, partially uprooted the trees, and tore the ground surrounding the Jinchuriki apart. The Akatsuki member yanked at his scythe, slamming it into the ground and using it as an anchor, slowing his body enough for his feet to touch down, and then using his chakra to come to a stop. Hidan grit his teeth in frustration. This battle was becoming more and more annoying for him. While Fu hadn't done any serious damage, her ability to fly was making it almost impossible for him to land a blow. He may not be the most skilled member of the Akatsuki, or the strongest, and out of them all he was the slowest, but his immortality, coupled with the fact that all it took was a single injury to take down an adversary, meant that it was still relatively easy for him to take down most opponents. Never mind that all too often Kakazu wound up having to sew pieces of his body back on. He was very tempted to just kill the girl once he finally got a sample of her blood, but he was well aware that if he actually did that, he would be punished by their leader. While he knew he couldn't be killed, he could be dismembered and left to rot. He knew that Kakazu would personally love to volunteer for that assignment considering he had already once tried to kill him by ripping out his heart, but even so he still didn't die, even when Kakazu crushed it to see if that would kill him. Before either could make another move, both felt another malevolent chakra signature, one even more vile than the one Fu was exuding at the moment, moving towards them. Naruto? Fu questioned, clarity piercing her rage-addled mind as she realized she must be sensing the chakra of Naruto's Biju. Turning back to the battle, Fu leapt into the air, her wings beating once more allowing her to fly, before breathing in deeply and releasing multiple, compressed balls of her scale powder, each the size of one of Naruto's air bullets with 3 times the force. Hidan sped through the clearing, darting through the trees, to dodge the rapid fire attack which scattered the glowing powder through the area, carved deep pits into the ground, and carved chunks out of the trees. When the assault stopped, he jumped after Fu, only for another chakra claw to burst from the foliage. Once again, all the Akatsuki member could do was block as the claw slammed into him, driving him into the ground. Fu's menacing orange orbs turned towards the source of the chakra claw and saw Naruto land in the clearing. She felt a slight sense of relief, overshadowed by the malice brought on by the chakra but still there, that the blonde was safe and miraculously healed. The two Jinchuriki looked at each other, taking in their similar forms. Both felt once again that they were staring at a kindred spirit, and a sense of understanding fell over them. Then, as one, they turned back to their opponent, Fu flying over and hovering a few feet above the blonde. They were thinking the exact same thoughts. The two would use all their power as Jinchuriki to protect each other and bring down their hunter. Hidan emerged from the crater he'd been sent into. "I'm getting fucking tired of this." He pointed his scythe at the pair of Jinchuriki. "You want to play like that, fine, I'll drop the both of you." With that, he rushed forward, ready to continue the fight. Jiraiya POV. Jiraiya jumped back off of a branch as a massive tentacle of threads, which tore about a fourth of the branches off of the tree, landing on the ground in a crouch and bolting to the side as the tentacle came back and slammed onto the spot he'd been standing on a mere moment earlier. Kakazu had transformed once again. His lower and upper jaws had completely separated, allowing a massive tentacle to come out of mouth, accompanied by 7 more coming from his back and where his shoulders should be. They were linked together by bundles near their bases, allowing him to fly, if need be. The area around them had been devastated by their battle. Dead and torn up trees littered the area, and all the underbrush had been burned and ripped away. Scattered fires slightly illuminated the area, and deep wounds had been carved into the ground. Kakazu seemed to favor massive, overpowering attacks that were difficult to dodge. Together with his speed and skill, and Jiraiya could see why he'd been recruited into the Akatsuki, even though he'd never heard of the man, which said a lot about his anonymity. He idly wondered what Kakazu would do normally when he has a teammate he has to watch out for. Remembering his earlier comment, he figured he probably either didn't care and let them get caught in his attacks, or was easily enraged into doing so. Which begged the question, how his current partner was still alive. Hopefully, it was either due to luck or simply not having been his partner that long. As Jiraiya dodged the attack, he saw the masks besides Kakazu's head open up, revealing a mass of water and an orb of lightning. Jiraiya slammed his palms together as the masks released their attacks, creating a massive vortex of electrified water, and slammed his palms to the ground. Barrier. 3-pillar formation. A curved triangular barrier appeared before him, protecting his from the wave. He grit his teeth as he channeled chakra into the barrier to block the massive attack. Eventually, the attack passed. Jiraiya released his jutsu the moment he did and bolted forward, but the moment the water cleared, he saw the lightning mask's mouth was still open, holding an orb of electricity. It released a bolt of lightning, electrifying the water he was standing in. Jiraiya's body convulsed as the lightning coursed through his system, and Kakazu's mouth shifted, seeming to smirk as the smell of burnt flesh reached his nose. Another tentacle then slammed into the Sannin's chest, sending him flying through one of the damaged trees and into another, creating an indentation in the bark before he fell to the ground, a small trickle of blood leaking out of his mouth. As he fell through the air, another tentacle sped towards him, separating into its component threads and moving to ensnare him and tear out his heart. Jiraiya managed to recover and land on his feet. Ninja art, Needle Jizo. His hair once again became a massive needle's hard as steel that completely covered every inch of his body just as the tentacle reached him. He then spun on his feet so quickly he appeared to be a miniature tornado, tearing up the mass and causing it to back away. The moment he sensed they were gone, he let up his defense, jumping over the threads when they lashed out again and ducking and dodging them as he charged towards Kakazu. He snaked around several tentacles that moved to strike him as he neared the ex-Taki Nin and pulled his arm back, ducking below one final attack and knocking Kakazu's arm aside before punching him in the gut, causing him to bend over. He then grabbed his head and slammed his knee into his face right between his eyes, dazing him slightly. Jiraiya then summoned a kunai to his right hand and slammed it into the water mask, causing it to cry out as a black substance leaked out before forming a Rasengan in his free hand as the tentacles moved in to ensnare him. He slammed the orb into Kakazu's stomach, causing the tendrils to cease their assault and writhed before the attack exploded, sending Kakazu flying back and away from him. He unfolded his tentacles and used the net of bundles between them to hover in the air, growling in frustration as the remains his water-hardened mask was expelled from his body, replaced by the fire mask, which began to rapid-fire fireballs at him. Jiraiya quickly body flickered to avoid the barrage of fireballs, which created a massive conflagration when they hit the ground. Feeling the searing heat wash over him as he watched from behind a tree, Jiraiya smirked as he wiped the blood from his chin. There was a reason Itachi and Kasama had feared the prospect of facing him, as Kakazu was beginning to realize. 3 down, 2 to go. Jiraiya thought as he looked for an opening. Naruto, POV. Naruto charged towards the religious fanatic, dodging to the side as the man threw his scythe at him and shooting forward before he could recall the weapon. Hidan smirked as he ducked under the attack, preparing to stab the blonde with his pike, only for the chakra claw to detach from his body and strike him in the face, sending the man flying through the air. What the fuck? A Jinchuriki's chakra shroud was not supposed to attack and defend on its own like that. It must be a unique feature of the Kyuubi's cloak. Damn it. He slammed through another tree and into the ground. Hidan was the type of sadomasochist who only enjoyed shared pain. He reacted to normal pain like a regular person, and as one would expect, he was not happy right now, his entire body racked with pain. That slash to the face had torn the flesh from his cheek, his cloak had now been totally destroyed, leaving him with only his pants and sandals, and his body sported various scratches and injuries. Coupled with the burns and the hole in his heart from earlier, and anyone who didn't share his gift of immortality would have long since fallen. He looked up to see Fu in the air, inhaling deeply. He burst into motion as she spit out a large compressed bullet of her scale powder, which hit the ground with enough force to make a crater. Hidan kept moving as she followed up with rapid-fire smaller balls of the powder at him. He jumped and yanked his cord, sending his scythe towards her, but she turned in time to see it and twisted out of the way. Seeing the Akatsuki member distracted, Naruto charged at the man, launching another chakra claw as he grew near. Hidan flipped, the claw narrowly passing beneath him, and with a deft movement of his cord, brought his scythe in for a follow-up attack on Fu, who flew up into the air to dodge. Watching as Hidan continued to flip, Fu grinned, seeing an opportunity. She dive-bombed straight at him as he landed, pulling her fist back. Hidan immediately leapt to the side as Fu came down, her fist colliding with the ground and creating an eruption of dirt and debris, tearing the area apart. Hidan suddenly felt the ground meet his feet and push up as the impact caused it to shift and immediately jumped again to get farther away, preparing to throw his scythe. Only for Fu's chakra claw to burst from the torn earth, slamming into his chest and sending him flying back. Once more he used his scythe as an anchor to slow himself before yanking it out of the ground and sending it towards Fu, who ducked beneath it. Naruto meanwhile threw out his arm and launched another claw of chakra at Hidan, which he leapt into the air to avoid. However, as he looked to the blonde, he saw him inhale deeply, puffing out his chest. He could do nothing as the blonde fired a drilling air bullet at him, which slammed into his torso. He could feel several of his ribs fracture from the impact before he was driven into a tree. Fu flew at Hidan, but stopped when she was only a few yards away batting her wings at him when she jerked to a stop and sending out a pair of sharp blades of wind in an X formation at him. He managed to jump to the ground just in time to avoid being cut in half, pulling the cord of his weapon. This time, Fu wasn't able to dodge in time and grimaced as the weapon grazed her side, blood staining the bandages on her waist. Hidan grinned. Finally he had one of them. Now he just needed to get back at the seal and he looked up to see Naruto coming down on him. He jumped back in time to dodge, but then felt his weapon was caught on something. His eyes followed the cable and his expression shifted to one of mild panic when he saw Fu in the air, holding his scythe by the shaft while grinning wickedly. Now, Hidan tended not to think things through, but he was by no means an idiot. He knew what she was planning to do and what would happen if he let this someone with super strength reel him in like that. Oh shit. Fu began tugging on the cable. Hidan let go of the cord connected him to the weapon and quickly reached down to the spool on his hip. Seeing this, Naruto slammed his fist into the ground, sending his chakra claw through the earth and towards the Akatsuki member. Just as he was about to unhook himself from the weapon, another chakra claw tore out of the ground before him, slamming into him and forcing him to release the spool. He didn't go far before jerking to a stop, the cable finally running out of length. With one final tug with the power the Nanabi's chakra gave her, Fu reeled Hidan in, dragging him through the air and setting him on a collision course with her. Still grinning, Fu pulled back her fist before launching a punch at the man's jaw with a cry of effort as she packed as much power into the attack as she could as she released the cable. The attack hit home, slamming into the center of Hidan's face. He could practically feel the cracks spread through his skull before he was sent flying out of sight from the Two Jinchuriki, crashing into the ground with such force that it sent cracks through the earth for dozens of feet. Fa Hidan said, his broken nose slurring his speech as he slowly rose to his feet. Bringing his hand to it, he snapped it back into place with a sickening crunch. Hearing rapid footsteps, he looked up to see the blonde rushing towards him. He threw his weapon at him, but watched in dismay as the blonde batted it aside with his right hand while pulling back his left. Hidan couldn't react quickly enough to evade this time. The blonde's chakra claw slammed into him before driving him down to the ground and kicking up another cloud of debris. When Hidan leapt out, his right arm was missing. Naruto cursed inwardly when he saw this. He'd been aiming to take off his head, but the man had managed to avoid the blow, even if it cost him. He gripped the stump of his arm as he snarled at the blonde. Fuck. That's it. He growled as he watched Fu fly into the clearing and land beside the blonde, her face twisting in pain as she kneeled down. The chakra that was giving her so much power was also burning her. She'd lost most of the feeling in her limbs. The strength she got from the chakra was the only thing keeping her up at this point. Naruto's right eye screwed shut as he felt a similar sensation. While he was better off than Fu, since he had been in this state a shorter amount of time and healed more quickly, it was still taking its toll on his body. He stood upright, his right arm was now almost useless and hung limply at his side. The two Jinchuriki were on their last legs. It wouldn't be long before their bodies could no longer handle the corrosive chakra surrounding them, and they were forced to release their forms, at which point they'd be helpless. Such was the weakness of Jinchuriki who lacked control. Except for Gaara, whose cloak was made of sand and didn't carry any risks. Lucky bastard. Well, not really given what he'd been through. You two will be my most glorious sacrifices to Lord Jashin. Hidan snarled as he gripped his scythe tightly. Hidan. A voice called out. All eyes were drawn to its source as Kakazu entered the clearing. The Jinchuriki's eyes widened. Had Jiraiya been defeated? Were they alone and almost completely worn out against two Akatsuki members? Good timing, Kakazu. Hidan smirked, shouldering his scythe. Damn, that guy put you through the ringer. I could say the same to you. Kakazu growled in response. Heh, whatever. Hidan said, turning back to the Jinchuriki. Now that you're here we can. We're getting out of here. Kakazu cut him off. What? The silver-haired man asked in shock as he whirled on Kakazu, his expression a mask of surprise. More tendrils had snaked down the missing nin's back and burrowed through the ground, bursting out and grabbing the man's severed arm before returning to Kakazu. I underestimated Jiraiya. I lost all but two of my hearts and had to use one of my last as a distraction. It won't take him long to finish it. The odds are too heavily against us. We're retreating. Now. The ex-Taki ninja said, his tone and gaze leaving no room for discussion. Hidan growled before scoffing. Just you wait. You won't be so lucky next time. he shouted, pointing his scythe at the two demon containers, who growled in response. "You're not going anywhere." The blonde shouted, knowing all they had to do was keep them there until his sensei returned from facing the heart Kakazu left behind, whatever he meant by that. Useless. Kakazu opened his mouth before spewing a wave of fire at the pair. Both jumped back before it exploded in front of them, the shockwave pushing both through the air and creating a smokescreen as they skidded across the ground. Once their line of sight was clear, they saw that the two Akatsuki were gone. Sensing someone else approach, they turned to see Jiraiya drop into the clearing from the treetops. The man's Haorian shirt were torn slightly in a few places. He sported scratches on his cheek, and there were a few drops of blood on his shirt, but otherwise, he was okay. Relief flooding their beings at the sight of him, they both released their chakra cloaks. Normally, it wouldn't be so easy due to their demons' attempts to influence them, but their bodies were close to their limits. The chakra dispersed, and both collapsed on the ground, panting heavily, sweat pouring down their bodies. But, looking at each other, they smiled. They'd faced down the Akatsuki and won the day. At least for now. Jiraiya looked to them both with a stern expression before looking where the Akatsuki had stood. Though they'd won, the battle hadn't been easy. He saw the blood on their clothing and the tears and guessed that the combined powers of their Biju had been the only reason they'd survived. He questioned whether or not it had been such a good idea to leave Hidan to them, though he'd realize he made the right call when he learned of his immortality. That, coupled with Kakazu's skill and widespread attacks, made for an almost unstoppable combination. Turning back to his student and the Nanabi Jinchuriki, both of whom seemed to struggle to stand. Naruto's injuries had been fully healed by the Kyuubi's chakra, but it was obvious to anyone that he had at some point sustained massive damage. In addition, his regenerative powers had so far done little for the damage the corrosive energy itself had caused. On the other hand, while Fu had only taken one small slash to the side as far as cuts go, she had obviously taken quite a few blows herself. Though all the Jinchuriki had enhanced healing, only the Kyuubi allowed its host to heal from minor wounds in seconds and critical injuries overnight, or in moments when its power was applied. While her injuries had somewhat healed and there were no bruises, it was still apparent she'd suffered some blunt force trauma. Naruto managed to get himself to his feet, but Fu could hardly raise herself up on her arms. Naruto kneeled down and aided her, slinging her arm over his shoulders as Jiraiya smirked. "Looks like you two had a tough time of it." "You don't know the half of it, pervy sage." Naruto panted as he and Fu looked up at the man. Both had no doubt that if either of them had been alone, they would have certainly lost that battle. "I don't doubt it." The Sannin replied. "I don't really feel like we won." Naruto commented, his brow furrowing as he looked to the ground, drawing Fu and Jiraiya's attentions. Seeing their expressions, he explained, "I get the feeling that guy wasn't particularly high up on the food chain in their group. He was probably the weakest one, and it took everything we had just to hold him off." Now Fu frowned too. Both knew that if the fight had continued, they'd have most likely lost unless they managed to cut off his head. And if he was actually the weakest member? With a sigh, the Sannin nodded, closing his eyes. "Yeah, that's the impression I got too." He then looked down on him, crossing his arms as he continued, "However, you should keep in mind that you two just fought against an S-class opponent and pushed him back. That's definitely something to write home about. Nice work." The Jinchuriki gave him tired smiles as he turned to the moon. "I don't think you'll be in any condition to be going anywhere anytime soon, so we'll rest here for the night. We can talk about heading back to Taki in the morning." Later. Naruto and Fu rested against the trunk of a tree, shoulder to shoulder, while Jiraiya made camp far away from the ruined site of their battle. The red cylinder Fu carried light against another tree next to them. The green-haired Kunoichi felt warmth from their contact. Normally, she'd tense whenever someone touched her, ready for an attack and instinctively seeing them as a threat. But with Naruto, it felt calming. She absolutely trusted him. She hadn't fully trusted anyone in years. Despite her wounds, despite the preview of the threat they were facing they'd just received, she found herself elated. She'd actually found a true friend. "I can still hardly believe it," Fu commented, drawing Naruto's attention. "I never thought I'd meet someone else like me." Naruto shrugged with a smile. "Hey, you know what they say, it's a small world. You're actually the second Jinchuriki I've met." Fu seemed surprised to hear that. Naruto considered the two among his most precious friends because they'd been through the same pain and loneliness he had. Something occurred to the blonde then, and he started chuckling. Fu looked at him curiously. "What's so funny?" "Nothing, It's just that, he said in between his chuckles. I've thought from the moment I met you that you were going through the same things I did. I didn't tell you about it because I was afraid of what you might think of me, he said, closing his eyes as he quietly cracked up. And you felt the same way, but if either of us had said something. Fu blinked before she too began to laugh, tilting her head back, and Naruto leaned his forward. Soon enough, they got themselves under control and Fu questioned, so, what was it like, growing up in Konoha? Naruto explained what he'd been through so far. He told her about Iruka and Teuchi, all those who knew what he was and accepted him. He also informed her that the third had declared it against the law for anyone to speak of his Jinchuriki status. Fu felt that was a mixed blessing, something that he agreed with. On the one hand, that allowed him to have friends among his own age group, something Fu didn't have. On the other, he grew up not knowing, always wondering, why everyone scorned him. She couldn't imagine that, living through what she did and constantly wondering why. Fu then shared a bit of her own life story. She had a few memories of the time before she became a Jinchuriki, but after that, her life had taken a dark turn. Unlike Naruto's experience, everyone in Taki knew what she was, and because of that the other children hated or feared her, often bullying her, and she couldn't fight back because most of the adults would side against her. However, she had had four people who had accepted her. Shibuki, his father, and an elderly couple who had run a restaurant she used to spend a lot of her time at named Hiro and Irie. They'd always been kind to her, giving her free food and teaching her how to cook and take care of herself. Naruto thought they sounded a lot like Teuchi and Ayame. However, the man had passed away 6 years ago and his wife a year later. I wonder, Fu began, looking up the sky. How would my life be if the kids in Taki didn't know I was a Jinchuriki? Would I have friends like you have now? Naruto shrugged, turning to look at her. It's never too late, you know. You could always go back to Taki and show them how wrong they are about you. Fu gave a bitter laugh at that, tilting her head forward. I'm not lucky like you, Naruto. Pretty much my entire village hates me. I accepted a long time ago that I'd always be alone as long as I lived there. And how can you expect that to change if you don't even try? Naruto asked, drawing her attention, causing her to look him. You remember Iruka? Truth is, he didn't like me when we first met either. Naruto admitted, surprising Fu as she recalled that the man was like an older brother to him. His parents died during the Kyuubi's attack, and for a while, he blamed me for it like everyone else. But because I never gave up and didn't try to push everyone away, I grew on him until one day he saw that I wasn't the monster sealed inside me. He smiled as he looked up. After that, he always looked out for me. He turned back to her, staring into her orange pools as he continued. If you just give up and act like everyone's out to get you, how are they ever going to see the real you? If you don't just push everyone away, then someday, you'll have precious people too. Fu couldn't help but smile at that thought. Because of how distant Shibuki was, she'd been pretty much alone since the restaurant owners had passed. The thought of having people close to her, a person she could trust and would accept her like them, and like Naruto, was something she hadn't even dreamed of in years. But then her smile faded, replaced by a somber look, causing him to frown as she shook her head. But how's that going to do me any good? It doesn't change the fact that Taki's just not strong enough to fight of the Akatsuki. And with Kakazu, they know how to get into the village. If I go back and I did find people precious to me, they'd probably get themselves killed trying to save me. Fu shifted, seeming to want to curl up into a ball. When I saw you get hurt trying to save me, it felt like someone ripped my heart out. I don't want that. I don't want someone I care about to die trying to protect me. Then you'll just have to do your best to protect them. Naruto answered. You can't just give up on everything. You and Taki still have years before Akatsuki should try to make a move again. That's plenty of time to get tough enough to stand up to them. Fu scoffed. Easier said than done. And if you can't beat them alone, then you can rely on each other or on allies like Konoha. Grammat Sanada wouldn't just stand by if Akatsuki attacked your village. Besides, like I told you, if you need help, I'll always come running. I don't quit, I don't run, and I'll never abandon the people I care about. That's my ninja way. Fu seemed a little hopeful at that. Seeing this, Naruto continued, besides, what have you got to lose? Who knows what Akatsuki's got planned, and each one of us they capture makes them stronger. Who's to say Taki won't suffer anyway if they win? That was true. She could only imagine what they'd do with the Nanabi's power. She'd only thought of the immediate threat to herself and her village, and that their leadership was thinking of giving up anyway. And there was always the hero's water. If Akatsuki suffered enough losses, they could go after it to bolster their powers. She hadn't considered that before because it was a village secret, but if Kakazu, a former elite Taki shinobi, was a member, she smiled then. He was right, she had nothing to gain by just giving up. Naruto, thank you. Naruto returned her expression. Don't mention it. Like I said, I'll come running anytime you need me. Fu's heart felt so light, so warm for the first time in years from having someone she could count on and hope for the future. Suddenly, she could feel all the fatigue from the battle weighing down on her. Coupled that with the level of comfort and warmth she felt at the moment, and her eyelids were growing heavier by the second. Naruto suddenly felt Fu slump against him, her head resting on his shoulder. He turned to her with a mildly surprised look on his face. Huh? Fu? It was then that the sounds of quiet, even breathing reached him. He saw that her eyes were closed and with a peaceful look painted on her features and realized the girl had fallen asleep on him. Naruto stared disbelievingly at her before he smiled. He wasn't exactly his usual energetic self at the moment either. He was feeling very weary after their long battle, and being close to a friend who'd shared his burdens made him feel relaxed as well. It was only a few moments later when he joined her in dreamland. Jiraiya finished setting up camp and turned to the pair. His expression shifted from surprise, then amusement as he saw that they'd fallen asleep on each other. He considered moving them to sleeping bags, but with their injuries, he'd probably wake them trying. Fortunately, it was a warm night, so he decided he'd let them rest. They'd certainly earned it. The next morning, the three packed up their little camp, ready to head back to Taki when Jiraiya's head turned up, sensing a presence approaching. After a few moments, a Taki shinobi with spiky, brown hair that stood straight up dropped into the clearing. Hey! The Sannin said, walking over to the man. What a surprise. We were just about to escort this little lady back to Taki. The shinobi nodded. So I see. Good thing, Lord Shibuki had hoped that you'd all be together. He turned to Fu, looking at her with distaste, causing her to avert her gaze. I'm surprised. When I saw the damage, I'd imagined she'd resisted, and you'd had to forcefully subdue her. He wasn't surprised when Fu glared at him in response to that, but he was surprised when Naruto's expression also twisted in anger as he took a step towards him. Before either could say anything, however, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a letter. At any rate, I only came here under orders to give you this letter from Lord Shibuki. He stepped up to Fu and handed the frowning girl the letter, vanishing with a body flicker the moment he did so. Fu glared after him as she opened the envelope without looking, turning her orange orbs to the paper as she unfolded it. Naruto looked at her curiously as her eyes moved back and forth, quickly reading the message while wondering what it was. Then her eyes widened and she let out a strangled cry, jolting slightly as if struck, and her arms suddenly trembled as her fingers gripped the paper. Naruto quickly moved to her side as she dropped to her knees, while Jiraiya's brow furrowed. Fu, what's wrong? Naruto asked as he reached her, moving to peer over her shoulder at the paper. Fu began, her voice quivering from shock. I've been banished. Both the student and teacher duo looked taken aback at that. What? Naruto snatched the paper, leaving the girl staring at her trembling hands, and read through it himself, his face twisting into a snarl as he neared the end. The message was a warning from Shibuki. Apparently, the council, with the village leaders' backing, had decided that Fu was right and officially banished her from Taki. He apologized, not that that meant much to either of them. He'd told her she was now free to go wherever she wanted, but that still left her alone against the Akatsuki. What the hell, Shibuki? Naruto mentally snarled as he stared at the sheet. How could he do this after everything that happened last night? What happened to all that he'd said about wanting to help her? Did he think the same of Jinchuriki as the rest of the village after all? I thought you were better than that. Turning back to Fu, he saw the shocked and lost expression on her face. The girl had just decided to go back to Taki and give making them accept her another shot, and now this? She hadn't moved an inch. She just sat there with a dazed look as she stared down at her now empty hands. Leaving by choice to protect the village was one thing. Being banished, especially after daring to hope again, was another entirely. It was her birthplace, and now whether she wanted to or not, she could never return. She felt like her world had shattered. Her mind was a complete blank, unable to think to do anything as she reeled from the news. And it wasn't just that she'd been banished, it was that Shibuki had supported it. Though she hadn't trusted him completely, and they hadn't been too close due to his position and duties taking up his time and keeping him distant, he'd always been the one who looked out for her best interest. Fu! Naruto yelled, running to the girl and gripping her shoulders, getting no response. Fu, are you okay? He knew she wasn't, but he couldn't think of anything else to say to the unresponsive girl. Say something. Finally, she snapped out of her daze, but her mind remained a blank. Now that she'd returned to the here and now, it really hit her. She'd been betrayed by someone she'd trusted, if not completely. She'd never see her home again. She felt her throat tighten as fresh pain radiated from her heart. What am I going to do now? Was all Fu could think to say as she sat on her knees, her gaze falling to the ground. It's okay. It's going to be all right, Fu. Naruto stated. She slapped his hands away, his words bringing her anger and sorrow to the surface. Okay? Okay? How was this okay? She was banished from her home. Her hope had been snatched away the moment it had blossomed in her heart. And what would the people of Taki think? While she didn't like them, she knew they'd take this as a sign that they were right all along. That she was never loyal to their village and had been waiting to betray them when her loyalty was reason she'd left. Clenching her eyes shut, she yelled, how's it going to be all right? I can never go back home. Do you think they're going to tell them why I left? They're all going to think they were right about me all along. How is this okay? If those guys won't accept you, then find a new home. Naruto interrupted, placing both hands on her shoulders. Like Konoha. Fu's orange orbs shot open and she looked at him, her expression showing nothing but shock. I'm sure Grandma Tsunade would take you in. You can join up with the pervy sage and me and come with us when we go back to Konoha. There are lots of people there who don't care about what I am, and I'm sure they'd accept you too. He took a step away and held out his hand, waiting for her to take it. So, what did you say? Fu could only stare at him. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. Join another village? She'd always been loyal to her birthplace. The few times she'd considered leaving, joining another village had never crossed her mind. After all, she'd been sure they'd treat her the same anyway. But what Naruto was offering, she wouldn't get her hopes up. She doubted the people of Konoha would accept her, but if there were people there who didn't think Jinchuriki were monsters, like Jiraiya obviously didn't given his closeness with her fellow Jinchuriki, then maybe it could be the home she'd always wanted. And even if she was right, he'd be there with her. Tears welled up in her eyes. In the back of her mind she found it funny that between today and the previous day she cried more than she had since she turned 6, as she realized what it would mean to go with them. She'd never be alone again. Fu didn't take his hand because she shot up and embraced him, wrapping her arms around him and burying her face in his shoulder as she cried, pouring out all the emotions she kept bottled up over the years. All the pain she'd endured, the sorrow and betrayal from her banishment, and her joy from the prospect of being by the side of a friend she could always count on and who could sympathize with her. Jiraiya sighed, but smiled. He was a bit surprised by this turn of events, but he wouldn't mind having another apprentice. Besides, his perverted side was thinking of how amusing this could be. Naruto, slightly startled at first, held her, not caring that his shoulder was growing wet from her tears. End of chapter 8.